Hey everybody, welcome to DBS Films Podcast. My name is Kellen. With me as always is my brother Brendan. Together we make movies with DBS Films. Today's episode we're going into how to keep your audience's attention as a filmmaker, part 2. Basically, we talked about how in the first episode, attention is getting shorter and shorter, and it is harder and harder to capture an audience's attention as a filmmaker. We go into kind of why that was, what you can do, but really in this episode, we're going to kind of give you more tactical information as a filmmaker to go ahead and basically get you set up to have the most success. And I think the best benefit here is it's something that we really learned through the Hateful Eight and making the additional movies that we have. So now that we're on to number 15, when it comes to setting up these movies to be as engaging as possible, because the more engaging the movie is, the better it does. As always, be sure to take a look at our Discord channel online, because we make movies for our fans with our fans. So if you ever want to be part of that process, you can go ahead and sign up for our editions there and take a look at whatever movies we might have out and online. So I think the first thing to really start and, go to is it's not as easy as it sounds. We always say, oh, make a movie that will get people's attention. Yeah, obviously you want to do that. Make a concept that's interesting. Obviously you want to do that. But I think what ends up happening, and it's something we've discussed, more and more, you really just don't understand until you've done it. Because I would say at no point in time, there was never like, oh, yeah, Gone, that's not going to be too interesting. Or Invited, yeah, no, people probably won't, understand what's going on here. We always thought we had something that was engaging and that was thrilling, and the plot point was unique, and that pop scare would hit, and all of these things we thought would happen, and they just did not translate. Because again, this is our first time really being filmmakers, trying these concepts of doing whatever. And I think that's the biggest thing that you end up seeing, and why we always encourage the more movies you make, the better you get, is you start to really understand what does capture people's attention and what doesn't. So, what are your thoughts on that? Because no one sets out to make a boring movie.
Yeah, and it's very difficult to see this, especially on the script level. Even when we're doing now, so we've made 15 movies. There's still a lot of stuff where when you're writing it, it seems engaging, it seems entertaining, it seems fine. And then when you actually put it on the timeline and you start to, actually make the movie, edit the movie, all of a sudden you're like, wow, that, pop scare didn't hit, or we have a whole bunch of dialogue back to back to back. And there's boring times here. And, that can be, I have a sixth sense for it now. And if I ever get like that tingle of like, oh, this is way too much dialogue, this is 2 back-to-back boring scenes, I can make the changes. But even then, to give you an example with the Roger project, I wrote that with all these things in mind to, understanding that's a one-person movie and we have to get it to go all the way through and keep people's attention. We ended up having to edit a lot of this stuff and move scenes around to make the movie a little bit more engaging, because we had almost like a 10-minute dialogue dump in the beginning of the movie right off the bat. And, the script is engaging, everything works. It in my head, it's fine. And then, we put on the timeline and immediately I'm like, oh boy, we have to make some changes on this. We added another scene, God bless Andrew for coming in here and doing that, because I think that really made the movie much better. And it's a great movie now. But if we didn't have the experience, I think past Brendan might have just uploaded that with the, the way it was written and the way we kind of filmed it. And immediately we would have had issues with people turning it off, because it's very, very lore intensive for 15 minutes, very dialogue intensive for 15 minutes. To me, this is cool, and I think a lot of people will like it. But for our AVOD friends and people who, watch these movies and turn them off very quickly, we had to use our editing skills. We had to use our ability to film these to do some pickup scenes. But now I think we have a really solid movie that's well paced. But once again, that just comes with experience.
It really is the sixth sense. Like, it's hard to describe it, but you just start getting a feeling of when things are going to hit and not hit. And I mean, we talk about it all the time. You might think something's going to hit and it just completely misses, aka the car not starting and Gone, and being the biggest example of it, where it just doesn't move the needle at all. So I think this brings me to one of the bigger, slogans that I really stand behind when it comes to filmmaking is You can be a good movie, you can be a bad movie, don't be a boring movie. And the biggest issue that you see with movies is if it's not engaging, that is your real risk there. I'm someone, and just like Brendan is as well too, how we'll have something on while we're working and we'll kind of just, seeing what's out there. And I can't tell you, there have been a lot of movies where I will just stop. It will take my entire attention because I'm like, what just happened here? Well, something so ridiculous, something so out there, a concept that was really crazy, something you didn't expect, just ridiculous action for no reason. All of those things can be something that pulls my attention to the screen. And it can be good, it can be bad. But again, if it's those things that are just boring and nothing's happening, nothing's paying off, even if the story is so good and things on like a symbolic level mean so much or whatever, you got a bad movie, that's action packed. And I think one of the greatest examples of this could potentially be Armageddon. I know Armageddon, as Brendan mentioned, is one of his favorite movies ever. But when you start breaking down the plot points of Armageddon, it doesn't really make too much sense. But you know what? It's not boring. So what are your thoughts on that? Don't be boring. Everything else can be fine. It's really just that's the Achilles heel for most filmmakers.
I mean, rule one for indie filmmaking and filmmaking in general is don't be boring. And it's more difficult than you think it is. It's very hard to not make a boring movie. So it's something that comes with experience. I think with each of our movies, they get more and more action. But you have as a filmmaker the downbeats, and you want to, develop your characters. You want to tell the lore of the story. You want to build the world. And every time you do that, you're taking away from action and craziness and, not boring stuff. So you kind of have to balance it, and to balance it and pull it off right is very, very difficult. I think that is how you become a really good filmmaker, is having the perfect balance of story building, world building, character development, and, moving the plot forward. But Michael Bay is one of my favorite directors, and I think a lot of people give him flack for his movies, but none of them are boring. They're all super exciting. They just don't make any sense if you sit down and think about them. And that's like my favorite movie is Armageddon. Doesn't make any sense at all, but the movie is so fast paced. There's crazy stuff happening all the time. There's multiple crazy plot lines that are happening. And to me, this is the perfect example of don't make a boring movie. And you know what? Armageddon, I think, probably made close to $1 billion. And if you look at, there's 2 asteroid movies that were released at the same time, Deep Impact and Armageddon. Deep Impact was a slower burn movie. It had character development. It had more world building. It had all these emotional heartstrings. And that movie bombed in the reviews and in the box office. And then you have Michael Bay, who's like, I'm just going to put these redneck oil drillers on an asteroid. And that movie made $1 billion. So it works out in indie, and it works out in, the films nowadays. It's the Armageddon effect. And if you're an indie filmmaker, if you have to fall back on something, fall back on not being boring.
I think we have potentially the seeds of Brendan's masterclass of the Armageddon versus the Deep Impact approach. Because honestly, it really is that case. Like Deep Impact is like a serious look at what would happen with that. They understand like everything there. And Armageddon is like, let's land on the comet, which right off the bat, physically impossible. That is like you're talking high school level physics. You just ask like, well, how fast is this thing moving? And then once you get that answer, you understand the entire plot makes zero sense.
Well, and they slingshot around the moon to go faster.
Yeah, so first they go back, and by the time it crosses from the moon to there, we'd have like a millisecond to react. So
but they also blow up the ISS, the International Space Station, too. So it's like that movie is wild.
I need to watch it. When they jump the buggy, next podcast is gonna be a 5-part breakdown, scene by scene of Armageddon. But then you're already at this point of it not making any sense, and it's like, well, even if they sent like a NASA crew up there, it makes no sense. And Michael Bay's like, no, we're getting this ragtag bunch. Each one of them's like just the scene of them rounding up each of the crew members. One's at a strip club, the other one's like being chased by a helicopter on like a dirt bike. Like that is the perfect example of, if you're exciting, it is something that works. So again, that's one of the biggest things that we always stress to. I think the harder thing, as you mentioned, is it comes down to the devil's in the details. Michael Bay has just been an expert of catching people's attentions, whether it's music videos, whether it's, commercials that he was doing, whether it's his movies. So he gets it. And I think this is, again, one of the harder things, and why we recommend making movies is you don't understand pacing. You get that sixth sense element of it. And we had beat structures, and we said you need to do, upbeats and downbeats, and like we were actively working at this structure. And as you mentioned, even in A Cold Grave, we still had to like tweak and move it. So it's something that does develop when it comes to pacing. But I think one thing that we learned pretty quickly is you just want to have as many upbeats as you kind of can that make sense. And, in the horror element, I think because of horror movies have scares in them, the pacing is much easier to do usually. But if you watch any of our movies, I think as our movies increase in quality, they're increasing in the suspense and the payoff of these pop scares. And guess what? Surprise, surprise, you see the ones that work again, and you don't see the ones that don't work. So what are your thoughts on how you will get an idea of pacing? But I think from our early point, we should have always leaned in more. Like I would jam things with too much versus thinking you have enough. Because I think as a writer, you always think you're going to have the full attention of the audience, and you always think things are going to pay off and be scary. And if you miss one beat, you're kind of in, no man's land. So I think one of the first things you can do is set yourself up to have multiple points of engagement. This can be loud sounds. This is like, again, I'm working here. I hear a loud noise that made zero sense. I'm literally going to stop, look, rewind 15 seconds, see what that was, and be like, oh, okay, that's what that was. So that is just the effect that some of these scares can have on people's attention. That is how you get them to look up from their phone. That's how you look, into something. The creepy music starts playing. Now I'm focusing on the screen. So I think one of the first things is, the more upbeats you try and put in there, and the better you get at upbeats, the easier you are to kind of maintain that. So what are your thoughts on that kind of mindset to have?
Just to give you my mindset and my feedback on myself with Horror in the Forest, and hopefully this thing gets released at some point in the next 10 years. I would have moved up the Nelson character 20 minutes. So you have an 8-minute intro scene, 4 minutes of character development. We're going to the woods, and then Nelson. Cold Grave, I would have moved up the craziness another 20 minutes. So you have the intro hook, Nelson or Ben explaining what's going to happen, and then craziness. With Bigfoot, I would have done the intro scene and moved up the craziness even further. And like we're struggling with this. Like it's a consistent struggle to get your audience into this movie as quickly as possible is very, very, very difficult. And it's something that I'm struggling with because I do want to build these characters. I do want to build the world. I want to explain and make it very clear what's happening, but it's just taking too long. And it's something that, we're actively working on with Girl in Cabin 14 is how do we get these people into this situation, basically into the cabin as quickly as possible? And how do we get things to go bad as quickly as possible? And, I'm trying now, if you have a 7-minute intro scene, to have the bad stuff start happening at the 15-minute mark, and then the really bad stuff start happening at the 30-minute mark. And once you get people to the 30-minute mark, the midpoint of the movie, they're going to watch all the way through as long as you've done your job. But there's still 10 minutes so far in the last 3 movies that we did where I think we could have condensed it and brought it forward and got the scarier stuff. Same thing with the Shapeshifter. Until Ashley gets taken, that movie is kind of there. It's kind of going. There's creepy stuff. There's, things in the night. There's weird stuff going on, but it really doesn't kick into that next gear until she gets taken at the 40-minute mark. Horror in the Forest, we're at the 30-minute mark. Rogers, the 30-minute mark. I think Bigfoot might be a little bit earlier at the 20-minute mark, but man, we really got to get it quicker. And this is feedback that I'm giving myself, but is applicable to any indie filmmaker out there.
One of the best compliments you can ever get as a filmmaker is when someone's watched your movie, they can't believe that that was that long. And one of the worst compliments or worst feedbacks is when people think your movie drags on. So again, the pacing of that, how you can speed that up is super critical. I completely agree, and just trying to figure out what we can do to move it forward. I think that being said, it's always important to balance the story. We could just have a movie where someone just starts screaming and it's just pop scare after pop scare, but then you don't get the payoff, you don't get the satisfaction, you don't get their interest, because again, it's that perfect balance of action and getting them intrigued in the story and the overall plot that really will get them to a point where, they enjoy the entire movie, they leave a good review, they support you, they follow all of that. And I think one thing that we did learn, and this was actually something that was brought up in the podcast that I was talking about with the second screening, is we found out pretty early that you need to repeat the plot very specifically at multiple points in the movie. Typically, we do it in 3 parts. We do it in the intro as a completely perfectly contained concept of what can happen, in the sense of something along the lines, someone usually explains what happened, and then something bad happens to that person. Then we have a next person. So really just in the perfectly contained intro, we kind of explain what's potentially happening here, probably with the lesson out of it. Then usually what ends up happening is they meet someone who will explain the plot another time to them, usually by a campfire, very specifically. And then usually right before bad things happen, at the climax, we have one final kind of sum up of where we're at and what's happening. And the reason these scenes are so important is, again, if I'm sitting here like this on my phone, not paying attention, and if I'm working and I hear your movie in the background, I can understand if I miss one of these scenes, I can still understand the entire plot if I just catch one of them. So we do need to reiterate it. And I think we really picked this up specifically after like the Into the Forest and the haunting of the suicide house, because we had a very detailed plot. If you actually watch the movie and you're like taking notes, there's a very detailed plot about what happens, the name of the person, the characters. But the problem is we say it one single time, each little detail, and we don't lean into it. And what happens is, as a writer, you think, oh, they're going to hear this, they're going to hear this scene, and this makes it perfectly, and I'm good, and I'm done, I can move on to the next one. But what really happens is people are on their phones, they're not paying attention, so if they miss that one detail, they just get confused. Like what ended up happening with Into the Forest and the haunting of the suicide house is all these little details just confused people. They just had no clue what actually was happening. And what we did from that point on, once we improved after The Devil in the Room and kind of moving forward with that, even I would say Morgan and Say and Devil in the Room were big step ups in the plot, but now we have specifically plots for it. And guess what? That campfire scene, there's your trailer right there. So these are very critical. I think that, again, you want to be not as boring, having the upbeats, but if you want a story, having a solid intro, having that middle trailer, and then having that recap are such a crucial way to do it. And this is something where the creativity, in my opinion, comes with how do you do this? That's not just directly explaining something to someone. How do you do this in that engaging way? But from what we found, once we've moved to that area of at least saying the plot in a very straightforward way 3 times, we've been getting so much better feedback when we're doing the polls and everything after we show our super fans. They're following along with the story, they understand the stakes going into the movie as it progresses. So what are your thoughts on that?
I mean, that's, the core of filmmaking is just to try and figure out these problems. How do you kind of, deliver the story in a unique way? What characters can you bring in, AKA Roger, to kind of tell the plot in a way that is engaging? And I see a lot of filmmakers, especially indie ones, where they're telling the plot, but it's so long and boring and dry that you don't pay attention to it. I thought we did a good job in Force of Death with the Roger character, where, it was engaging. You were like, what is this guy talking about? And you're building the plot. It can be done like that. In, the Roger project, we have him viewing things that are explaining the plot. He narrates to the camera. Anytime you narrate to the camera in a found footage movie, it is very engaging. And then Bigfoot, the plot is told through just meeting a whole bunch of different characters. But you have to explain the plot and you have to make it very clear. I think a lot of indie filmmakers, like Kel said, they kind of water the plot down with a whole bunch of details and not focus on the core aspect of it. You have to make the core aspect very clear. But we did get a negative review for Horror in the Forest, which I thought was actually a positive review. They had mentioned that we restate the plot 3 or 4 times in the movie, and that annoyed them. And to me, that's good feedback, because that means they're understanding the plot. We're doing our job and we're going all the way through. I think those people, they pay attention to the movies. They understand the movie. And I think if you get that feedback, well, at that point, it's probably not the fact that they're annoyed that we delivered the plot 3 or 4 times. We just didn't do an engaging enough way to actually, or we didn't do it in an engaging way to make it kind of, as creative as possible. And that's something we can go back and look at. But once again, it's one review. I don't give weight to one review. We got our Discord feedback, and I'm waiting to see the Amazon reviews once the movie releases. And then we'll make decisions. But yeah, if we get that multiple times saying, hey, these guys told us to plot this movie 4 times, and that was excessive, I don't think it's excessive. I think we just have to be more creative.
I definitely agree, and props to that person. I love that. That's a great review. Here's the last thing I do kind of want to end on. And hey, all doom and gloom as always when it comes to filmmaking. No one's paying attention. No one's going to watch your movie. No one's going to care. Here's the easiest way to get people to pay attention, to watch your movies, and to frankly just give a shit about what you're doing. And that is by building a community. And I think this is one of the bigger benefits that we see of making multiple movies and having a community. If you have someone who is watching your movie because they are a fan of your work, they will just in that process be more, they pay more attention. And the movies that we kind of mentioned earlier in this week on the last podcast, where we were saying every once in a while there will be a movie that I put my phone down, I'm not working, I'm watching. Guess what that movie's from? It's from an indie filmmaker that we follow, that we've watched his past stuff, that we're watching it again. And I think, one of the biggest differences we see is in the Discord community. We have trivia night on our movies, and they pick up on little details that I would never imagine a random individual to ever see ever in the movie. But they watch it so closely that they can do trivia with us, that they can do all of these things. When they watch our super fan movies releases, the feedback that they give is always so focused in because they care about DBS, because they care about the community, because they care about what we're doing. And I think this goes back to why Christopher Nolan can make a 3-hour movie. People care about Christopher Nolan and what he does. So honestly, one of the best ways to get attention is by keep making work, to get people who do like this movie to come back. And I mean, I see it all over the place. Not only do we see it in our Discord community, but even on like Letterboxd, we have people who, once they understand what we're doing, they're like, hey, this is my second DBS film. I have to admit they've gotten better. I like that they did this. And like, it is such a change when you get someone to come back and watch your movie again. Most people are used to it being a one-off experience that sits in a silo. But if you can make it something where they're coming back and watching what you've done over and over again, you're naturally going to have way more attention. And that's really what you want to be as a filmmaker now. You want to grow, create this community, because that is where you get the longevity to continue to do what you love.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of respect for filmmakers in the filmmaking community, but also just the general audience. The fact that if you're continually making stuff, me personally, I am more willing to follow you. I'm more engaged in your process. And I kind of look at it as your blanket of work. Are you getting better? What lessons are you learning? How do your movies compare with your other movies? There's about 5 or 6 indie filmmakers who I kind of follow because they consistently put out movies. They'll put out 2 or 3 movies a year. And to me, that's really cool. And I'm not the only person. The found footage group loves, the people in the community who continue to put out movies. They follow their journey. I've seen it from people who have watched our movies. If you go look, a lot of our reviews are like, with Force of Death, hey, this one looks a lot better than Murder House. They got a lot better with cinematography. They learned these plot points. I didn't like this stuff, and they're comparing it to our other movies, which I think is really cool. And you get a lot of people who watch your back catalog. I think this is the biggest thing that I really saw with this last release was when people watched Force of Death, Murder House had a huge increase in views. Girl in Cabin 13 had a huge increase in views, And some of our other movies had a huge increase in views. So people are going through our back catalog and watching all our stuff. If you're not consistently making movies, if you're not building a community, you're going to lose out on this effect. And we have 15 movies now. Most of them are free, but usually if you watch a movie, I think you get like $1, via Tubi revenue, but that's $15. So instead of $1, we're making 15. And that's just going to be the philosophy. I can't wait to, have 50 movies and the 50th movie takes off and does great. And the people are like, hey, let's see where these guys started from. And then God bless them, they go watch Gone.
Yeah, you're a real homie if you watch Gone, and we appreciate it. That being said, it's going to go ahead and wrap up this episode. Hopefully you have found it insightful on how to keep people's attention. Hopefully we kept your attention. But as always, be sure to take a look at our Discord channel online. Be sure to take a look, watch all of our movies, because as we mentioned, you can see us getting better, and it means the world to us, allows us to keep doing what we love. But until then, have a good one, my friend.